Well, hello patrons, and thank you for your support. This is our first question and answer session, so we'll see how these goes and we'll see how they develop over time. But I'm going to come to the questions that have been asked by a number of you, and let's just work our way through them and see how we can answer them. Lennart Jensen, you said, how much does it cost to restore a big vehicle, something like the Tiger or the Matilda? And do we make our own parts here? It's a really tricky question because if I'm entirely honest, I don't think we ever know how much something ultimately costs us. Sometimes we've had grant money. Back at the end of the 90s, we had over £96,000 from the lottery, the Heritage Lottery Fund in here, to help us with our restoration of the Tiger One tank. If I'm honest, I reckon about £250,000 worth of labour and help in kind and voluntary work and everything else went on to restore that Tiger One tank. And this is our problem because sometimes it's very hard to keep a track. We know what we spend ourselves, but it's very hard to keep a track on all those other things that people do for us for free, or they give us something at perhaps a reduced price, etc. But a little bit of an idea, our fan drives we didn't have fan drives for the Tiger One. To make the fan drives so that we could put the Maybach HL230 engine in, the original Tiger One had a HL210, those fan drives cost around £30,000 to just build these two fan drives. That was just the engineering cost. On top of that, we had lots of other help, work in kind, people doing copying drawings for us, etc. So overall, it's really hard for us to pin down the actual cost of a total restoration. We are trying to keep a better track on our Matilda 2 that we're restoring at the moment. So keep an eye on those Matilda diaries. In there we show some of the things where we're going out to get things made and what we can make, tooling, some machining inside. But and again, keep an eye on these programs and keep an eye on the museum websites, because what we'll be doing from September of this year, again with Heritage Lottery money, we're going to be building some new workshops. And as part of that, part of the facilities will enable us to make probably more parts ourselves. Having said that, inevitably you have to go out to specialist contractors at times to get things reproduced. But so this is kind of like work in progress. We're trying to get better at recording how much something really costs us, and certainly for the future, so we can estimate how much real cash we're going to need to restore one of the later questions, maybe another big tank, you know, what that's going to mean for us. So we'll keep you informed. So next question. Joshua Lawrence, you said, hey, are there any plans for doing running restorations to the museum's other Tigers or Panthers, the Jag Tiger or Jag Panther, Tiger 2s? Yes and no. At this moment in time, we have a Tiger exhibition on, we've got vehicles in the museum. I've just mentioned the fact we're about to build some new workshops. At the same time, we are putting together a program of what we want to do in those workshops. Now, there's lots of vehicles in this museum that, if I'm entirely honest, we've barely looked inside over the last few years. We're doing sort of initial assessments, you know, what's there, how complete is it a vehicle we might be able to run, and why do we want to run that vehicle in the future? Now, we know big, heavy German armour is really sexy for so many enthusiasts. Tiger One will not run forever. We kind of know that. We know it's inevitable it's going to run out of, we'll be doing too much damage or too much wear and tear at some point. So in the back of our minds already, we're thinking, let's get a spare engine together for the Tiger One in case that breaks at any time, because that's probably its biggest vulnerable point there. And also we're thinking, we've got two King Tigers. There is a Jag Panther running, or nearly running, in the UK. There are certain other vehicles. There's a couple of Panthers being restored, and again, maybe in the future we'll be able to see a running Panther here at the museum, even if it's not our own. But in the UK, the chances of getting a running King Tiger is pretty slim. So part of our assessments as we're going around those vehicles, we're looking at each thing logically, but what might be those tanks that we put up as a kind of, I keep using this word, overused word, iconic, but what is going to be that tank that we all go to look at and think that's going to be a massive draw to the museum? Now, we don't want to sound too cynical here. We know that restoring Tiger One has really helped put the Tank Museum on the map. It really draws the eye, you know, the number of views on YouTube of every time the Tiger runs, the interest that's in there. probably something like a King Tiger will have perhaps not the same, but a very high level of interest. So inevitably we will be thinking about those vehicles, but I would also emphasise we have to keep that in a balance with the rest of the collection and what we want to do. So doing a major restoration and bringing something back to running order, like a very technically advanced German tank from World War II, takes a huge amount of time and energy. Would some of that time and energy be better spent on doing upgrades to a number of other vehicles around the museum? And don't forget as well, we are the British Tank Museum. We definitely want to see some of those British vehicles return to running order, our Crusader, our Churchill, etc. So again, I'm afraid at this stage of the game, watch this space. It's a debate we're having within ourselves at the moment, you know, within the museum complex. So we'll let you know again, and certainly we'll be making a big song and dance about what we decide we're going to restore and run, and also record that, as we are with the Matilda diaries, so that people can understand why and how we're going about it. Interceptor 57. Is it true that the coaxial machine gun on the Tiger I cannot be fired at the same time as the turret is traversing? If so, why? And this one, we had a little look at this, because the real problem here is your same foot, your right hand foot, that has a pedal on the turret floor for the gunner, he's actually pressing that foot down to traverse the turret. He would have to lift that foot, move it sideways to depress the coaxial machine gun pedal that's next to it. So we were trying to work out whether you could actually keep the foot down in two places at the same time. We don't think you can, but you know, I think this is almost a question for one of those veterans, if they're still out there somewhere, because I bet there was a bodge or a way the guys could do it, or whether they could move over their left foot and get it into the same area as the right foot for actually then pressing the coaxial machine gun pedal at the same time as pressing down the traverse pedal on the right with your right leg sort of thing and your right foot down there. So it's a slightly tricky one. My gut feeling is I bet they would have found a way of being able to do it. But technically, it's your right-hand foot, two pedals next to each other. How can you get your foot on those two pedals at the same time to do the two operations? So it may well be the case there was a real issue there. Adrian Mace, why are we painting the Matilda? What are we painting the Matilda, and what's her history? Now, I've written down our history of our Matilda 2, just so you get the very nerdy techie details. Our particular Matilda 2 was built at the North British Locomotive Company, that's up in Glasgow, and it was delivered on the 28th of May in 1941. So it's not one of the tanks. There was only 28 of them, or 23 of them actually. 23 of them went over to France with the BEF to fight in 1940. Ours was too late for that. The tanks that did go over to France, not one of them made it back to the UK. Now, we know Matilda 2 is a brilliant design. It is a fantastically well-armoured tank for the time, and as we keep banging on about, that 2-pounder gun would have gone through any of the known German tanks in the 1940 campaign. We always make that point as well. Matilda 2 is the tank, along with the French Char B, that when Hitler's reading the reports of his 47mm anti-tank guns bouncing off these vehicles, that's what starts him doing the Tiger project. So again, the myth that the early war British and French tanks were not that good, forget it, okay? So again, looking at our tank, so going back to what we think we're going to paint it. So we think our tank, it was delivered down here, we think at some point, to the School of Tank Technology. It ends up being used, we believe, as a training tank, so it probably doesn't see a battle service. Now that's another one of these dilemmas a tank museum has. If we painted every tank in its absolutely historic accurate colour, we wouldn't really be able to tell the history of armour, because every vehicle, like a lot of our German vehicles, were captured in North Africa. Does that give the impression, if people come around, if they're all in desert colours, that German armour was only used in North Africa? As well as some of the vehicles had long service lives that we've got, and they go through a number of different iterations. Quite often, just like about the aeroplanes, think of all those warbirds that are flying that had actually ended their service lives. It's things like a weather plane, you know, or a slightly obscure role. That's why they're in service longer. So we always expect, when we come to a museum, to see things in the epitome or the height of their service, rather than those obscurities or what's left over, which is quite often what museums actually get, you know, in terms of the actual vehicles. So with the Matilda 2, We're probably going to paint it green initially, do its filming and photography, so we've got a lovely record of its actual probably colours in service. But because of the role we've used it here for, which is to illustrate the Matilda as a brilliant British innovation, bit of kit that was used to great effect early in the Desert Campaign, we're going to paint it in that Qantas scheme over the top of the green. So we'll seal the green, we'll think of a way we can try and do this. We're doing some experiments now so we can have almost like peel-off paint schemes, do the Qantas scheme, and that scheme will represent Bob Foote's tank, because we've got Bob Foote's Victoria Cross here at the Tank Museum, and we want that tank to represent the role of that British armour early on in the North African Desert Campaign. So that's a debate again in the museum. You can imagine if we did everything accurately, this museum would look very differently. We've still got tanks in completely spurious paint schemes that really need changing. It takes time and energy to do all that, so we're working our way through. But sometimes as well, depending on where we're going to exhibit the tank and what role or story we're telling with that tank, that's why sometimes we will choose a colour scheme that might not be accurate for that very, very individual vehicle, but it helps us tell a better story here at the museum. So I hope that helps with that one. So last question, Drew Switzer. Are T-34s really as hellish to drive as some historians claim? Well, we've got a fantastic archive and library, and there's personal accounts, there's all sorts of things in there. Again, like with so many of these very famous tanks, you've got to be a little bit careful about what you're reading. Some of those first-hand accounts, the guys are in love with their tanks and they say, you know, they're the best thing since sliced bread. You read some other reports where people are a little bit more critical of how the tanks worked, how rough it was inside a T-34, what it was like to drive it. So you'll read some there, and again, you've just got to be careful. Where are those reports coming from? Is it a genuine first-hand account? Is it people trying to add to the propaganda, add to the myth, or is it people as well trying to balance, or perhaps even revisionist historians trying to go the other way? So there's been some recent publications on the T-34 saying, come off it, let's stop kidding ourselves, maybe it wasn't this great tank. But I've read a first-hand account where the guy says actually has a wooden mallet next to the gear lever, so they could whack that into the gear lever. And again, think, a massive production of tanks, they are not all going to be the same. At certain times, materials and machining went up, went down in quality, so there's going to be differences on the different model T-34 or the factory production or the time that vehicle was made. What I would say though is that our own drivers here, we have filmed our own drivers driving the T-34, and it is undoubtedly one of the most you need to be muscular to drive it. It is really physically demanding because you're pulling on levers. Don't forget, again, with some of our vehicles, the brakes are already warm. We're having to pull a bit harder to get the same effect as might have been when it was earlier on in service. But you really have to use physical force to pull those levers and maneuver the tank around. And I think this idea about how hard it was to drive a T-34 physically, they were short guys, don't forget 5'8" maximum height, quite often muscular. But I think that story, there's bound to be a foundation in fact there that you're going to have to be a fairly butch, good upper body strength to be able to get this thing around the battlefield properly. But we'll see if we can dig out some of the footage of us driving our T-34 so you can see there just what it's like for the guy inside. We have a fairly big guy, Brian, who sometimes drives our T-34. One lap round the arena, he always comes out bathed in sweat. So yeah, it's not the easiest thing to drive. So that's answering our first set of questions there for our patrons. Again, thank you very, very much indeed for supporting us. We hope you like this as a format. Let us know, because obviously we can change it. We can see what different things, and we'll see how we go. We're inside, by the way. This is our Chieftain we're in at the moment. Let's see what other tanks we can get in as we're answering the questions.